Again, this is Frolic and Absurdity, 1950s sci-fi movie boom. And for some reason, you guys all want to hear about that, so that's great, because we'll talk about it. We could start by introducing ourselves. So, I guess I'll go first. I am the moderator. I'm Stephen Gashler. I write young adult fantasy/humor. Probably more humor than fantasy. I am also a filmmaker. It's more of a hobby, but I've been pumping out a lot of videos on YouTube lately. It's been a lot of fun. One of my videos was in the film festival yesterday here. I write plays and musicals, and I write music. And I'm giving away my album, Valhalla, a Nordic rock opera, if you guys like Vikings and rock music. For anybody who shares your email address with me, I will give you a digital download to that. So come up and talk to me after the panel.
I'm Richard Teasdale. I am also a filmmaker. I mostly work in video editing. I've edited 3 shorts that are produced locally. Evening with My Comatose Mother. I have to remember all the names.
Which looked absolutely freaky, by the way.
It's awesome. Kiss the Devil in the Dark and Creatures of Whitechapel. I also am the deputy director of Film Quest, which is a local film, a genre film festival here in Provo. We do that in the fall. And I directed a web series called Unsung Heroes, which was a lot of fun.
I've seen Unsung Heroes, that's pretty good.
Yeah, well, awesome, thanks.
My name's Tom Carr. I am the owner of Bag of Holdings Productions, family-friendly filming. I also own Carr Photography. Started back in high school. My very first film was Bill and Ted's Bitchin' Adventure. It was shot on a VHS camera, and basically I followed my buddy Bill and Ted around with the camera, and I loved it ever since. And then I kind of got out of it for a while, and then I came back, and I had a friend ask me to write a horror film called Extra Credit, which we submitted to the Canadian Film Fest and took an honorable mention, and aired right before Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, which I think was really cool. I recently sold a full-length feature, and I'm in contract, or at least discussions, trying to sell another. And I love classic sci-fi, so I'm excited for this panel.
My name is Eric D. Snider, and I'm a film critic. Have been for about 20 years. Sometime this year I'll write my 4,000th movie review, which I wouldn't have even guessed there were that many movies. It turns out there are. And also I'm a big fan of sci-fi nonsense. It's been fun.
I'm Robert Starling. I produced the first student film done at BYU back in 1971. I'm the old guy around. And I'm a big fan of sci-fi. Had a great opportunity when I was doing public television down in Alabama to have Leonard Nimoy come on my show that we had. So, but it's great to be here.
Speaking of, Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner both did some pretty horrible sci-fi films.
Why don't we go through the panel and share maybe what a favorite 1950s sci-fi movie we have is, and why we like it. And I'll prime the pump by saying one I watched recently was Destination Moon. I thought that was fantastic. It was made in 1950, I think. It was actually made in 1949. I think it was released in 1950. So it was almost exactly 20 years before the actual mission to the moon. And it was awesome because, I mean, here 2 decades prior, we're seeing like the best projections of what it would be like realistically, of what it would be like to be in outer space, what it would be like to actually land on the moon, about all the things that could go wrong, about the political challenges you'd have to overcome, the technological barriers, and it was just really cool.
My favorite is actually Forbidden Planet, which the reason why I love that film so much is I like that it's it's an adaptation of Shakespeare's The Tempest. I think that the acting is really solid in it. It looks like a B movie, but it doesn't play like a B movie. It's really well done. It was a precursor to Star Trek in a lot of ways, and it has Leslie Nielsen playing not a funny person. which is kind of different.
I just want to say ditto. Forbidden Planet's probably my favorite as well for almost the exact same reasons. Not to mention it was one of the first, I want to say color chrome films out there.
Yeah, it's beautiful looking.
And really well done. The sets were incredible. The story was actually pretty good for the time frame, and
The special effects are pretty good for the time frame too.
I mean, it really was, I want to say, the basis for most, if not all, modern day sci-fi. It really was. So it is one of my favorites. I own it on DVD, and I probably watch it once or twice a year. So.
The Day the Earth Stood Still was one of my favorites from 1951.
That's number one on this list.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's aliens visiting us, but it's not an attack, not an invasion, so it's kind of different in that way from a lot of them. It's one that I just think is very interesting. I think it's interesting how a lot of those movies in the 50s were talking about things that now are real, but beforehand, it's so fascinating to see what people's perception of what the future would be like.
And it's interesting, too, to see a lot of these were remade.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
What would be like impossible to prove, but it would be like a really fascinating study would be like, how could we show what impact science fiction had on what became science fact?
Yeah.
And looking at 1950 cinema is a great,
Totally.
example for that.
Well, I liked Them with the giant ants. It was kind of cool. But then Creature from the Black Lagoon was one that I really liked when I was a kid. I saw it when I was 10 years old. And it was in 3D. And this is how we used to watch 3D back in those days. And you're not only looking through rose-colored glasses, but also blue-colored glasses as well. And they showed it at the Varsity Theater at BYU a few years ago, about 5 years ago. And in 3D with the glasses, and I got my picture taken with the monster. So, well, and we can pass these around so people can see some of those.
As a 10-year-old, did that movie scare you?
Oh yeah, yeah, very much so. A lot of these I didn't see because they were too scary.
So, how did the world's technological and political climate lead to the decade that opened the door to the golden age of sci-fi? That was a seed question that I thought was really cool.
So,
I mean, the Cold War was a huge thing. The imminent threat of nuclear destruction played a big part in all of those. And the nuclear thing is what led to Godzilla and the giant monsters. That was a thing a lot where
The bombs that we dropped on
the bombs, that was having these unintended consequences. The Cold War was a huge
yeah.
I remember the 1950s very well. They're vivid in my mind.
You're thinking of Happy Days.
Oh, sorry. No, exactly what you said, but also too. I mean, it was also the escape. It was the escape. Drive-ins were just really starting to become popular, where a lot of these films were being shown, and. I honestly think that if it wasn't for drive-ins, we probably would not have the sci-fi that we have today.
Yeah.
Because that's what drove the industry. They were making what a great opportunity for people to go in their car, hang out, and watch 2 or 3 films, and then go home. And they were producing them that way. And so I think that's political-wise. Obviously, I wasn't a 1950s person. I wasn't alive then, but the sci-fi was. We were on the verge. We wanted to go to space. Mm-hmm. We were talking about it. We had these ideas. We had this desire to go to the moon, and it had been for a long, long time. And we had finally reached the stage where the technology was almost enough to where we could do it.
Yeah, it was in '57, I think, that Russia put up the first satellites, Sputnik.
Yeah.
And I was 11 years old. And that was the fact, like you say, the fact that going to space was beginning to look like something that was possible.
It definitely was the final frontier for most of us. We were like, what are we going to find?
Yeah.
Is the moon made of cheese?
Yeah,
I don't know. Let's find out.
the birth of the atomic age had happened just right before the 50s,
Yeah.
and I think that was basically all these the fears that would come with that. What does that mean? Are we going to all turn into mutants? Are we all going to?
Not to mention the fact that in 1947 you have Roswell and UFOs.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
But and comic books played a big part of this as well. The youth were really into comic books, and the majority of the comic books in the late 1940s, late 1950s were sci-fi, space monsters, horror. Back to the Future plays a big joke on that, but it's true. A majority of that time frame, the kids that would become us today were wanting to know more about those things.
I wonder if like so many of these 50s movies were about giant animals or monsters of various kinds, and I wonder if this was so soon after World War II, and in the 50s, like people were just learning some of the more details of what had happened during the war, and just the horrors of real life monsters. I feel like this movie may have been an escape from that. Sort of make up some fictional ones just to take our minds off these real awful atrocities.
That's possible, or even an imagining of what World War III would look like. 'Cause I think that we've had two in succession, and I think a lot of people were wondering, what's the next World War going to look like?
Yeah.
It's fascinating watching Destination Moon because the rationale and the story of what drove forward this race to get to the moon was the fear of whoever could launch missiles from the moon first will dominate the world. And that was enough to convince everyone in that film that this has to happen. We are totally in. All the investors forked out their money there. We see in hindsight, that fear was totally kind of not founded. Nobody's launching missiles from the moon many decades later. But it's that type of pioneering sci-fi that helps us realize those things that we just wouldn't have known otherwise.
Well, we don't know that for a fact because the moon landing was shot in. Never mind.
Anybody see Capricorn 1?
What are some common themes? We've talked about some of them, such as monsters, maybe a bit of the Red Scare, etc.
I honestly think one of the most common theme in all the films in 1950 was the good guy always wins. There may be a point where they're almost at a loss, but no matter what, the good guy's gonna always win, and that was the mentality that we had coming out of World War II. We came in, we fought the bad guy, which was Hitler. We won. That's how life is supposed to be. There isn't supposed to be a negative side to life, and you see sci-fi now where that's not always the case. In some cases, the bad guys do win, and in life, we see the bad guys sometimes do win. But I mean, that's my opinion of 1950s films and 60s and 70s is that it was the good guy. The good guy was always the hero. Was always the best.
I think that fear is a common theme in the 50s. Fear, but mostly fear of the nuclear threat of some sort. It could either be how the nuclear is affecting people or animals, but it could also just be nuclear war. But yeah, we talked about the Red Scare. Red Scare is definitely a big one. But also, seems like fascism kind of is a common thread in there.
Which again, left over from World War II, still kind of thinking about that a few years later.
Yeah,
for sure. A lot of the movies involve teenagers too, like The Blob is about the teens, and I think that coincides with the drive-ins being a teen thing, and then the 50s was the first time that teenagers became a demographic that were marketed to and paid attention to. And so you had the drive-ins and they'd make these movies that would appeal to teens, movies that you maybe didn't have to pay too much attention to in case you were maybe making out instead of watching the movie or whatever.
That never happened in drive-ins.
Sure, it never happened. But that was kind of the beginning of I mean, now everything is geared toward teens or toward youth anyway, and that was kind of the start of that as these teenagers started to be a group that mattered to people who make entertainment.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
have anything to add, Robert?
I enjoyed those days.
Very good.
So did I, damn it.
Now, did you enjoy the movie or the girl?
I'll take
He was
the
only
bet.
10.
Oh, come on, mistake.
Well, in 1959, I was 13.
Okay.
It's just old enough to make it.
I had my first date at 11, though.
Oh wow.
There you go.
Things were different in those days.
Who were some big players in the 1950s boom? Directors, writers, set designers. Any big names that we should know about?
Well, Ed Wood.
No, come on now. Ed Wood was gosh, I don't know many of the names, to be honest with you. I just know the films. I mean, you're talking to I mean, I'm a geek from Geeks.
Yeah.
Friday nights were, let's turn to Channel 13. It wasn't Fox. It was Channel 13 for Turkey Theater.
Yeah.
Where they showed the classic horror films every Friday night, the giant spiders.
I think what you're hitting on there though is that these were low budget films. These weren't, a lot of these were big budget films. So whoever directed them was some guy who, you know, they found and directed.
Under the studio system, was
Yeah.
on contract to make
he was
the
under,
movie.
yeah.
The actors weren't necessarily big names.
So what,
So
why is that? Was sci-fi not esteemed back then?
You got to look at the way films were made back then too. It was you have, I mean, pretty much what, 2 or 3 major production companies that were pumping out. I don't know how many films a year, how many films a week. Sometimes they were using the same sets for multiple films. So they would hire directors, they would hire writers. They didn't have, you know, the George Lucases. They didn't have the Seth MacFarlanes. They didn't have those guys. They had multiple guys that were sitting in a room with a typewriter, punching away, making, you know, $50 a week, handing in a script, and moving on to the next one.
yeah.
It was definitely a production line view of filmmaking.
And yeah, they called them B movies because they would play before the main feature. They tended to be a little bit shorter than the main feature, and they tended to be, you know, B movies, not your A movies. They're your B movies, and they in general kind of didn't take them very seriously as art, but they were fun to make, fun to watch, and they. Now looking back at them, we see a lot of them were really brilliant, but at the time, kind of throw away.
And most of the actors were, you know, there were some people that made a living at it, and that's what it was. It was a living. It wasn't. I'm not going to be, you know, the next Oscar. This is a steady paycheck, and I don't have to go wear a suit and sit in an office all day long. I get to do something that's fun and I enjoy.
Yeah,
I forget which movie it was. You asked about names. There was one of those B movie science fiction that James Arness had a significant role in. He later became Marshall Dillon on Gunsmoke.
Yeah, a lot of people started making those kinds of films, and apart from like Vincent Price and Bela Lugosi, there weren't very many actors that were like associated with horror. You kind of made whatever movies you could make, and that would include some horror movies or some sci-fi, but there weren't people really very many.
And the actors were
specialized
owned by
in it.
the studios.
Right.
They MGM. You worked for MGM. Paramount. I mean, things like that. That's who you worked for. You had a contract. You signed a contract. I'm going to make 10 movies this year. And that's what it is. John Wayne, I think, at one point made 30 films in 1 year.
Wow.
What I think is fun is when you go back and watch those old films, you will find someone who eventually became a big name.
Yeah.
Right? You'll see like Peter Graves.
Yeah, we saw Steve McQueen and
Steve
Steve
McQueen,
McQueen and Leslie Nielsen.
Leslie
and,
Nielsen, yeah.
I mean, and some of the
Jack-
voiceover actors.
Jack Nicholson is in the Little Shop of Horrors.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
You'll find people who are at the very beginning of their career and their acting is suspect.
Taking whatever jobs they could get,
Yeah.
these sort of low budget things. Yeah.
And behind the camera, it was a little later than the 50s, but Roger Corman became known for being the king of B movies.
Right.
Yeah.
And he was a producer, and I guess he did direct
Writer,
also.
director, yeah. Yeah, you made them fast and cheap, and usually not good, but fast and cheap though.
You joked about Ed Wood, and that's exactly what he did.
Yeah.
Fast, cheap, and hey, it kept a dress on him and a house over his head. A roof over his head.
And you'd get some real gems in there, like amidst all the all the throwaway stuff, you get some that were actually like really good. I guess if you make 30 movies a year, law of averages, a couple of them are bound to be pretty good.
Yeah.
And some of those gems later on become. I mentioned this on an earlier panel. Last Man on Earth, which eventually becomes Omega Man, which also becomes what was the
what is it?
I Am Legend.
I Am Legend. All three of those are based on the same story. So
I like Omega Man better.
I'm Last Man on Earth, but I'm a Vincent Price fan. So.
So we talked a little bit about how movies like Destination Moon might have influenced the space race, or how Forbidden Planet may have influenced Star Trek. What are some legacies that the 1950s cinema, especially in sci-fi, has had on the world? What are some themes that were pioneered, that have influenced the world either through actual technological advances or through artistic tropes that we've inherited and improved upon?
I just got to say Godzilla.
I was going to say, giant animals. I mean,
Giant animals.
Giant animals are
The
still.
most latest reincarnation, there was what, Cloverdale?
Yeah.
Cloverfield had a thing, yeah.
Cloverfield.
And there was another Godzilla, another one coming out. Yeah.
But yeah, the kaiju.
The monster that wouldn't die.
Yeah, the big giant monsters.
Yeah.
Whoever was the first one to think of making a big giant monster in a movie kind of influenced a lot, because they've never gone out of style.
You know, my favorite was when the American franchise tried to take over Godzilla. It was like 1999, and they made Godzilla in Los Angeles.
Godzilla 2000.
Godzilla 2000. Yeah.
Was it Godzilla 2000? Well, that was the Japanese one that came out just after.
You're talking
about 98, the Matthew Broderick one.
Yeah, Matthew brought 98. Yeah.
Yeah, I just thought it was funny how America tried to make it cool with CGI and make it more mainstream, and then like a year later, Japan just releases another guy in a suit because that's what people really want.
Exactly. Just, yeah,
And I had literally removed that image of that movie out of my head. Thank you very much.
I think that the themes about humanity finding peace are pretty common, or at least sometimes, at least in some of the science fiction, the higher-minded stuff, and I think that still resonates with people.
Well, that's all. I mean, I think that's what everybody wanted then. Was we want that great escape, but we want to ultimately say no more wars.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, you're led into the 60s and 70s with that.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, exactly.
You talked about remakes, you had War of the Worlds, 1953, and then Tom Cruise did a version of it.
Right.
And
I like the original better.
The Tom Cruise, you know what though? All in all, the Tom Cruise one was not horrible.
No,
I thought it was going to be horrible, but it was actually pretty decent.
Yeah.
And then the one that you were talking about, the one that was
Destination
number one,
Which one?
the Day the Earth
Still, which the remake
That was
was really
remade.
good too.
Keanu Reeves did a remake
right.
of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, most of these have been remade. The Blob was remade in the 80s. The Thing from the World became the Thing. Most of those big ones that got remade at some point, and they didn't have to change very much. Like the general themes are still kind of the same. I think that the idea of Mystery Science Theater calls it tampering in God's domain.
Yeah.
The mad scientists who are trying to create things. That's still an ongoing thing. And as in real life, we've seen more and more medical and scientific advancements that are like sort of playing God. It's become even more resonant than before.
And it's interesting to note too that horror wasn't a genre in the 1950s. It was a sci-fi. It was considered sci-fi. The horror films that you think of were science fiction.
Yeah.
And I want to say it was probably, and I was born in 71, but I'm going to say late 60s, early 70s is when the horror genre really started to come out.
Yeah.
George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, things like that. But when you think of classic horror films, they're actually classic sci-fi films.
Does anybody know the first sci-fi film?
The Man on the Moon, or is it
Trip to the Moon?
Trip to the Moon?
Milliers, yeah. Trip to the Moon.
Yeah, Millier.
Which you can actually watch on YouTube, and I think Netflix has it as well.
Yeah.
As a
It's a
colored
silent
version
movie.
of it. Yeah, it has a colored version of it.
That's a little earlier than the 50s.
Yeah, but if you've never seen it, it's very interesting to watch and to see how, like, all many of the tropes of science fiction were there right from the beginning, including wanting to go to the moon. Like that's what people always wanted to do is go to the moon.
Yeah. You know, it's fun watching the original War of the Worlds. One of my favorite things is how it ends at the very end. The aliens catch the cold, and and the narrator says, "And thus we see that in God's wisdom, He placed a coal that would save us all in our time of need." And like, wow, you don't get that in modern cinema anymore.
No, that's the Hays Code.
Yeah.
What are some takeaways? Like, what are some things as maybe modern storytellers, maybe filmmakers, we can learn from the 1950s sci-fi filmmakers that they did well, that maybe we could adapt for modern age, modern technology?
Go ahead.
Just keeping it simple. Like most of these movies had very simple premises. Often just here's an invasion of aliens, or here's some giant animals, and then we fight them. And you don't need to overcomplicate it. It doesn't need to be a really complex story. Just keep it simple and stick to the elements of storytelling.
I think too, for filmmakers today, especially low budget like myself and some of the others, or people out here that might be thinking about making a film, using one camera. Learning how to, if you watch those classic films, typically they filmed everything with one camera, and they worked around it. It was basically recording a play on this set, and the camera they would use.
Oh, I see. Like they don't do like over the shoulder cutaways.
No, it was straight cuts. It was very few angles. It was very few close-ups. It was one
That was probably
maybe two
due to
cameras.
the budget a lot.
A lot of it, but still, if you look at that, that's one of the things that I took away from it. Is okay, can you shoot a movie with one camera?
And what are the benefits of that?
Budget.
It forces you to keep it simple.
Yeah,
it forces you to not get ahead of yourself.
Do you think it improves the quality of the acting, maybe? If it's more cohesive?
No, actors are actors. Actors are actors. You can have bad ones, you can have good ones. You just hope to God that they do okay, and don't forget your lines like I did several times when I was filming.
Although it is certainly easier to give a good acting performance if you're just there with the other characters doing a scene, as opposed to being in front of a green screen, or as opposed to doing a lot of technical things.
Well, that's why I'm saying when you break it up into every reverse shot, there's not that sense of persistence that you have when you're performing in front of a live audience.
Yeah.
Going back to the takeaways, I think one of the lessons that, like the day the Earth stood still, I think had a very great lesson in it, that a great takeaway that, don't shoot first and ask questions later.
Yeah.
Because the alien that came to Earth then was a very benevolent race that just wanted to see if we were worthy to join the intergalactic community or whatever.
And it's interesting. It's interesting too that if you think about that concept, how much sci-fi uses that.
Yeah.
The whole concept behind First Contact in Star Trek is: are these people ready to accept what we have to offer?
Yeah.
Same with Contact, Jodie Foster.
Yeah. Are these people ready to accept what we have to offer? And
So don't shoot first and ask questions later.
Okay, let's turn it over to the audience. Do you guys have any questions?
oh, come on.
Any aspiring 1950s sci-fi filmmakers out there?
Yeah, Bill.
You haven't mentioned Twilight Zone.
No.
But
That's true.
was Twilight Zone a film?
It was TV.
It was TV,
Yeah.
but he shot it like a film.
And mostly in the 60s.
Yeah, and most
Lots
of
of
the
shorts.
Lots of shorts.
Yeah, but Twilight Zone definitely continued a lot of those themes and those basic good versus evil, sort of stories.
Twilight Zone is definitely a product of the 50s sci-fi boom. I think that's
True.
definitely
Yeah.
a reality.
And then all the things that Twilight Zone influenced. So yeah. A lot.
Yeah. Does anybody have a favorite film that they like from the 50s?
Didn't mention yet.
How about you? Have you all watched some of these classic horror films?
Are you going to go home and watch them?
So those
Well,
are kids.
my my favorite is Plan 9 from Outer Space.
Plan 9 from Outer Space.
How insanely weird it is.
Yes. Same with Santa Claus invades, or Martians invade.
Santa Claus conquers
The Martians.
Santa Claus conquers the Martians.
Martians or something like that. Or Santa
Yeah.
Claus on Mars.
The Fly.
The Fly, another great one.
Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Another one? The two more that were remade.
Did you know there was a Plan 10 from outer space that was shot here in Utah?
No, I didn't.
I did
Was
hear
it worth
that.
watching?
It's horrible.
I mean,
low
really,
budget, very-
we've mentioned some of the best horror films in the 1950s, but there were some really, really bad ones involving large spiders.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Even the top-rated ones, like Body Snatchers, if you think about the plot, it makes no sense. Anyway, it's true.
Well, I think that's something we should also bring. We could also bring up though is that we've talked about the best films from the 50s, but there's some really entertaining films from the 50s that are awful, but they're so much fun to watch, and they don't deserve to be ignored.
Well, the first film that was ever shot in my hometown in Georgia, it was done when I was just around the time I graduated from high school, and it was called The Kiss of the Tarantula.
Were they giant tarantulas or just a lot of them?
Just a lot of them.
Those are the two. They had giant things or a lot of
Little tiny things
Right.
that. So, and you can find some really great spoofs on 1950s horror films. One of my all-time favorite is Attack of the Killer Tomatoes,
That's a good one.
which is probably one of my favorite spoofs on 1950 horror films.
I like Mars Attacks.
Mars Attacks.
Mars
Yeah.
Attacks is another great one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't really understand some of these spoofs unless you've seen the originals.
Yeah.
Why do you think like the 1950s like kind of like focused on monsters and then like later it kind of went into more technology-based ideas?
I think we kind of brought that up, but to re-utter the whole fact that we had just gotten out of a war, and people could not believe that we were killing innocent people. It was when the announcement came in World War II that the Jews were being killed like they were. There were many people who didn't believe it, and to this day still don't.
It's so
It's so
How
overwhelming
can that
to
be
them.
true?
How can
Yeah.
that be true?
Holocaust
How can-
deniers.
Well,
yeah.
But that brings up the whole monster thing. There is no way a giant ant is gonna happen.
Yeah. That's a common theme. Is there's always some guy trying to tell everybody that there's some giant creature out
coming.
there, and they're like, no.
No, it's not possible until they
It's not
see it, and the
real. Right.
first person who usually sees it is an attractive young woman who is really good at screaming. And then as soon as she screams, they go, "Oh, a woman saw it, so it must be true." And that's the whole. It led to the whole thing. Not to, most men lie, but that's beside the point. I think that's why monsters were such a big theme back then. Is because it was an inconceivable concept for us.
there were
Inconceivable concept.
And there were also like budget and technical restraints. And putting a guy in a rubber suit, not that hard. And then in the 60s and 70s, you had better technology. You could do more things. So I think that was probably a factor as well. Kind of what they
Paper
had
mache
access to.
and
Yeah.
a lot of paper mache and some black paint and some strings worked really well.
Or some what is it called when you shoot something up close to make it look big? Foreshortening for
Miniatures.
It's force perspective.
force perspective. Yeah.
Force perspective.
I think another way of looking at it is kind of the evolution of human imagination. And it's so fascinating to see, like, what was the limits of what you could even conceptualize back then? You get something like Forbidden Planet, and of course you're just going to have people on other planets, because what else could there be? It would take more decades to, like, really think beyond.
people who are blonde and speak English.
and 1950s accents and everything, yeah. And so, like, a monster is just an easy go-to, right? You can always just have a monster there in the periphery. But, decades later, look at modern sci-fis, like Interstellar. Like, the thing that's frightening about that is, like, the effects of relativity. But, like, that was so beyond them at the time. So.
Well, that's something to also think about, because the 60s and 70s brought us real hardcore science fiction. So something started in 2001 and somewhere in that area, and we started getting really good science fiction. But I don't think that would have been possible if we hadn't had that era of the 50s where people were just enjoyed going to the movies with watching a crazy monster.
And if those filmmakers hadn't seen those movies and then been inspired by them to make their own sci-fi movies.
Yeah.
Well, it's somewhat of a departure from the subject here, but I think there was an interesting, the development of Star Trek in the late 60s really wasn't any sci-fi on television until
Yeah.
Star Trek came along of any significance. And I think the thing that endeared me to Star Trek initially was that it wasn't just, space stuff and everything, but there was always like moral to every story. It was like, something solid there.
Something relevant.
Something. Gene Roddenberry was genius in that regard, I think.
Yeah.
And of course now it's opened the doors to all other kinds of.
And we have to thank Lucy Arnaz, Lucille Ball,
Absolutely.
for
Yes.
Star Trek.
Yes.
If it wasn't for her, we would not have Star Trek.
I don't know that story.
Desi Arnaz,
Their production.
Desi Arnaz Production produced it, and Lucy went in and said, "No, we are going to make this show, or I'm canceling everything that we've made."
Wow, fantastic.
If it wasn't for Lucy, we would not have Star Trek.
So we're almost out of time. My biggest takeaway is let's mimic these pioneers of cinema and sci-fi, and see how we can push the envelope of imagination in our time. So people will look back and think, why were films so wonky back in the what do you call it? Our
2010s?
The 2010s. Yeah. Why couldn't they see anything beyond the damaging effects of relativity? I don't know. You guys want to take just a few seconds to have some closing remarks? Anyone else?
Go and watch 1950 horror and sci-fi films, and just look at how cheesy but good they are. They are the basis of most modern day filmmakers. I mean, there were. I remember taking a required class on classic sci-fi. It was a required class in theatrical arts for what I was doing, because they were the basis of what we're doing today.
Yeah, have fun, just watch them.
Yeah.
Don't
Grab
take
some-
it too seriously.
Yeah, grab some popcorn, turn off the lights.
Some of them are super boring though.
Yeah.
So watch with friends.
Do some mystery sci-fi on them. Do some mystery sci-fi 3000 on them. I mean, just have some fun with it.
Yeah.
Good.
All I have to say is live long and prosper.
Thanks, everybody. Come say hello.
Thanks a lot.